Good morning and welcome to our session this morning. I'm just going to give this a few moments to allow our attendees to come from the waiting room. We haven't got anybody coming through yet. Oh, here we go. I can see we've got people joining from the waiting room into the live session now. That's great. Okay, let's make a start. So welcome to this morning's session from Awesome Tech Training. Today, talking about how the web development process works. So before we get into the kind of core presentation, a few housekeeping points. You'll notice as you join that your microphones are all muted, so you can hear us, but we can't hear you. We are recording the session this morning. I just have to double check. I have pressed that button. Yes, we are definitely recording the session this morning so that we can get a link to you once the session is finished so that you can watch that back at your leisure. There'll also be an opportunity in that email for you to download the slides. So any links and things like that that we're showing will be available to you when we send those materials out. Please do ask questions as we go through or at the end. There's a chat function and a Q&A function on the control panel at the bottom of your screen. We will answer what we can via text, chat in the background during the session, but we do allow some time right at the end to ask some of those questions live of our presenter. So if you have things that crop up, things you'd like to ask, please do submit those. So introductions. My name's Rachel. I'm on the business development team here at Awesome Tech Training. I've got two colleagues on the line with me this morning. I've got Steve Hanlon, who's mostly in the background, helping to field questions as they come in. Hello, Steve. And I've got Lorna Walker, who is our main presenter for today. So Lorna, I'm going to hand it to you.
Thank you. So just to kick. Okay.
Sorry, that was me. I pressed the wrong button. Just checking you're on the ball. Good morning.
Hello. Right. Let's just quickly run through the agenda. We're going to kick off. I'm going to just explain briefly who we are and what Awesome Tech Training does for those of you who haven't worked with us before. And then the content of the webinar is really focused on running through the basics of the web development process, right from first principles. What is a website? Working through things that you need to think about when you're naming your website, when you're building it, working with a designer or a developer or building it yourself, how hosting works, maintenance and support. So really all the sort of practical considerations of the web development process. So this would apply either if you're starting from scratch with a new site, and a big chunks of it would apply if you were redeveloping an existing site as well. And then, as Rachel says, there'll be time at the end for questions. And this really is a kind of free for all as far as questions go. There really aren't any stupid questions in this webinar. So anything at all that you want to ask about any of the things that we talk about today, please do feel free. One of us will certainly be able to answer it or follow up with you afterwards. So things you've always wondered about or don't quite understand, anything like that, hit us with it. Okay, now my slides don't work. So Awesome Tech Training, our focus is really on helping small businesses to take control of their own web presence. So a lot of the kind of thinking behind the webinar today is really is to help you understand what are the things that you can do yourself and what are the things that maybe it's better to get help with. And we've got a sort of flagship product is our Build a Website in One Day with WordPress course, which really works for two kind of groups of people who want to build a website completely from scratch, or people who have an existing WordPress site and just want to understand it better. And you can do that as a self-paced video version of the course, or you can do one-to-one over Zoom with us, tailored, whatever suits you. We also offer WordPress advice and support, and indeed general digital marketing advice and support. You can book sessions with us by the hour. So drop us a note if you've got some sort of project in mind that you'd like to talk to us about. We've got a whole series of other webinars, so in addition to this one, and I'll talk more about those at the end of the session, excuse me. And because you're here with us today, we are offering you discounts and special offers and so on. And as I said, I'll talk about those at the end of the session. So we will start at the very beginning and think just for a moment about what we actually mean when we say a website. So what is a website? So really, at its heart, a website is nothing more complicated than a collection of different resources that are organized in folders. So those resources might be pages with text on them, they might be images, they might be videos. So no different really than your folders on your own computer, your My Computer or My Documents. You've got a series of folders. Within those folders, you've got different kinds of content, videos, images, text, whatever else. And they're ordered in some kind of structure, a hierarchy. And the website is essentially the same as that. It's similar to the collection of folders and files, but rather than being hosted on your computer and only accessible by you, your website files and folders are published on a web server, and all that is just a publicly accessible computer. So in principle, you could have all of this stuff on your own computer, but your computer would need to be turned on all the time and attached to the internet all the time. And there would be all kinds of problems associated with that. So you use a web hosting company, and we'll talk more later on about what that means and things to consider and so on. So your folders and your files and so on live on a web server, and then users can access them via a piece of software called a browser, as you know. So Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Safari, these are all different types of browsers. And what the browser does is interpret and display the HTML pages. So your website, typically, the documents that go to make up the website are going to be written in HTML, hypertext markup language. And there are a couple of options, sort of broad categories of ways that you can build a site. You can build it by writing the HTML yourself. So this is known as hard coding. Or you can use what's called a content management system. So something like WordPress or Wix or Squarespace are examples of that. And all the content management system does is essentially generate the HTML for you. So a non-technical person can develop a website without having to learn how to code. There might be some circumstances in which you'd want a hard-coded site. We'll talk more about this later on, but I think in almost every situation, a content management system is really the way to go. So you can think of your website as being sort of like a house, and there are three things that you need for your website to be accessible by people. So it needs to have an address, like a house would. An address on your website is your domain name. So where do people go to actually find your website? Your domain name points them in the right direction. Then you need the actual structure of the house itself, somewhere for your website to live. And as we talked about a moment ago, this is the hosting. And then you can think of the data files, the content of your website, as being like the furniture that goes to make up your site. So we're going to talk about these different elements sort of in turn, and the things that you would need to consider if you're building a new site, or indeed, as I said, if you're kind of zhuzhing up a site that you already have. So let's start by talking about things to consider when you're naming your website. So choosing a domain. So your domain is essentially the address of your website, as you know, I'm sure. And then all of the collection of the pages and whatever other content you have, your images, your videos, etc., all of the content that makes up your website is grouped together, accessible via your domain name. So that's what people would type into their browser in order to access your website. So you register a domain. If you are setting up a website from scratch, you might have a domain that you already own, or you might need to start by registering a domain. And when you register a domain, you're leasing it rather than buying it outright. So you might lease it for a year or 5 years or 10 years. Typically, the longer the period that you lease it for, the cheaper it's going to be. But there are other factors that influence the cost of the domain as well. So really, it's going to come down to the popularity. So I think that, for example, all of the 2-word domains made up of real words that exist were registered something like 10 years ago. And so it can actually be quite tricky if you're starting from scratch now to find a domain that's available for your business. How you start is by registering your domain, and there are numerous different companies that will do this for you. So I've given you links here to a couple, GoDaddy and 123reg, but there are plenty of others where you can register a domain. And it is literally just a question of, if we go to GoDaddy here, You can see here I am essentially on the GoDaddy homepage. It says find your perfect domain. So I'm just going to type in, or indeed this is the example I used earlier. Let's say I want Lorna Walker Practice. That's the domain I'm after. So I'm just going to type it in and search for it. And then GoDaddy is going to come back and say, okay, fantastic. And it's offering me different options and the prices for the different options. So I could have the .co.uk for 86 pence for a year, or .com 99 pence for a year. And then there's all these various different other options here. You can see for some of these, the extension at the end is different, .net, .com, .tech, etc. For some of these, it's actually suggested different configurations of the first part. So if you are searching for something using a combination of words that's very popular, quite often the domain registrar will actually suggest other options to you till you find something that works. And if I wanted to buy one of these, it would literally just be a question of adding it to the basket, putting in my credit card details and so on, and then I register it. And it belongs to me for the period of time that I've registered it for. If I don't re-register it at the end of that time, then it lapses and somebody else can come along and take it. So it's important just to keep up with who has access to your domain and when does it expire, if it's critical for your business. And of course, you can have more than one domain. So for example, it's pretty common for people to have both the .com and the .co.uk versions of their domain, and you can set one to point to the other. So you could use .com as your kind of website and have .co.uk or .net or whatever, all pointing to that. So it's a good idea, if it's not too expensive, to probably kind of hoover up the key domains that relate to your business so that you have them rather than your competitors having them. So it's worth, I think, understanding a little bit about what information is contained within a URL. So a URL points to a specific page on your website. There's actually quite a lot of information contained within that. So here's an example. This is the URL of the event booking page that you would have come through to book onto this webinar. So https://www.awesometechtraining.com/event/how the web development process works, what you need to know, blah, 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 blah. So let's break that down a little bit and talk about what the different bits of information are that's in this. So the first piece is this HTTPS at the start. So sometimes you'll see this HTTPS, sometimes you'll see this just HTTP. These days, if you just see HTTP, the browser will almost certainly have flagged up next to the name of the site, not secure. So HTTP, which stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So probably only useful to know that if you're doing something like a pub quiz, no other real practical reason for knowing that. HTTP tells your browser that you're looking for something that's online rather than on your personal computer. So it sort of points it in the right direction. And then the S, HTTPS, tells the browser that you've got a secure certificate running on your website. So these days, a secure certificate is kind of non-negotiable at this point. So Google, when it's looking to decide which pages to display in its search results, will always prioritize sites that are running on HTTPS rather than HTTP. And as I said, browsers these days are really flagging up to visitors to your site that it's not secure. So you don't really want your site with a big not secure next to it when people look at it. So if you're currently running on HTTP and you want to be running on HTTPS, the best thing to do is talk to your hosting company about it. So quite often these days you can turn on a secure certificate, quite often even for free or very small cost. The cost associated with it is tiny relative to the benefits that comes with it. Then we've got the www part. So I'm sure you know it stands for World Wide Web. You get no real points in a pub quiz for knowing that. And quite often these days, sites don't even use this. So it's not necessary. You don't have to have it. It doesn't really kind of do any job in terms of kind of a technical benefit of having it. So many sites these days don't use it. If I was telling people our web address and I just said go to awesometechtraining.com without telling them about the www, the link would still work. They'd still be able to access the site. So increasingly these days, you'll see people advertising their domain without the www at the front. You don't need to type it in. If it's needed, the browser will put it in automatically, and typically these days hide it. One thing just to be aware of is that if you've got www.yourwebsite.com and just yourwebsite.com, Google will treat those as two separate sites. So you need to decide whether you're going to include the www at the start of your web address or not, and then having decided that, be consistent, because otherwise you can end up with Google essentially thinking you've got two sites with the same content. And as I'm sure you know, Google doesn't like duplicate content, so that's not good for your SEO. Then we've got the domain. So we've already talked about this. This is the bit that you buy or lease, and it tells the browser where to go to find your website. So for us as humans reading that, it's words, but behind the scenes, the browser is taking those words and interpreting them into a series of numbers that are unique to your domain. It then looks those up in a directory called the DNS, and that tells it where to go. So where on the internet, what server does your website live on? So this is the key part for enabling people to find your website. And the .com bit is known as the top level domain. And as you saw when we were in GoDaddy just now, there are plenty of other options. So years back, you could really only have .com and .co.uk and a few others, but there's loads of different options now, .plumber, .net, .tech, all kinds of things. And we'll talk more about things to think about when you're choosing in a second. So anything that comes after the domain, after, in this case, awesometechtraining.com, is going to be additional information that's used by the browser and by humans and by Google to understand specific information within the site. So for example, this piece of information here tells you as a human looking at this or arriving on this page that you're in a folder on the site called events or event. So it gives you a kind of indication of how the site might be structured and where you might be within that structure. And websites are arranged hierarchical folders, as I said, exactly the same way as your My Documents folder. So the URL can be used to reveal the structure of that. This is useful for visitors. So visitors are not always going to arrive on your homepage. They could arrive on any page on your site. And clear structure like this helps somebody understand where they are within the website. And it's also useful for Google. So Google, the more that Google can understand the structure of your site and the kind of information that's within it, the better that is for your SEO. And then the last part is the information about the specific page that you're on. This is often known as the slug. WordPress calls it the slug. And again, if you arrived on this page, looking at that URL, just reading it would tell you quite a lot of information about what the page is about. The same is true for Google. So it used to be the case, you don't see it so much these days, but it used to be the case that this kind of part was quite often just like a big long random series of letters and numbers, or page ID equals 25, that kind of thing. WordPress certainly these days defaults, and has done for a while, to a more descriptive page name. But if that's not happening for you, it's a good idea to kind of look at your slugs and make sure that they're descriptive and they're keyword rich and so on. So if you're thinking about how to choose a domain, what are the things that make a good domain? So the first one is it's got to be available. And as I said earlier, this can be trickier than it might seem. A lot of, well, more or less all the domains are taken at this point. So it sometimes does take a bit of digging about to get something nowadays. On top of that, it also needs to be memorable. So the way that I would think about this is, if my domain was written like on the side of a bus or on a billboard, somebody's got 20 seconds to look at a thing and then be able to remember the domain afterwards. Would they be able to? So memorable, think about things like Sometimes you see people have put like a load of hyphens into a domain. Stuff like that can make it quite tricky for someone to then remember and write it correctly. Is it easy to understand? So does it explain what the business is and somehow relevant to your business? So again, going back to what I said about SEO, would Google understand that your domain is related to what your business does? You need to decide whether you want to go for .com or .co.uk or something else. So sometimes this will be a decision that's taken out of your hands. Maybe the .com isn't available, you can only have the .co.uk. Sometimes it's a strategic decision for your business. So a lot of times the sort of .com is kind of presented as the best, the gold standard, but actually a lot of times people who operate just in the UK prefer .co.uk because it makes it clear that it's a sort of business based in the UK. There are other options, as I said earlier. Some of these are restricted, so things like .edu or .gov or .ac, you can't just set up, I couldn't just set up Lorna's practice site .ac. I would have to prove that I was actually an academic institution or a government institution or whatever. Country codes, so that would be things like .co.uk, .ie for Ireland, .de for Germany. Those are quite often restricted, not always, but a lot of countries restrict those to people who are based in the country. Think about what it translates as, what it might mean in other languages, and how it reads when it's written down. So what seems like a good, nice, descriptive domain in your head can read quite differently when it's written down. And there are some examples here that I've given, which are all kinds of problematic when you look at them actually written down. So the first one is actually LA Drape, which is a curtain company. The second one is Kids Exchange, which is some kind of a charity for children. My favorite one is Holland's Hit Festival, which can be read differently. I think it's fairly explanatory what it is when you read it properly. The next one is actually Who Represents, which is a website for helping you to find the agents of different actors. And I can't even read it properly now, Therapist Finder is what it sounds like. But all of these, you know, seemed like a good idea at the time, basically. So let's talk about the actual building of the website. What happens when you come to construct your site? So I'd say there's kind of three key decisions that you need to make here. So the first one is, are you going to build it yourself or get someone else to build it for you? And we'll talk about what kind of considerations there might be when so you might sort of think, well, obviously I'm going to have to get someone else to build it for you. But content management systems essentially mean pretty much anyone who's reasonably competent with a computer could build a website these days. So don't assume that you're going to have to get somebody to build it for you, but there are circumstances in which that might be better. We'll talk about that. Do you hard code the site or use a content management system? So I would say almost always you would use a content management system, and then following on from that, which one should you use? So we'll talk about these various things as we go through. So our whole ethos as a business, as I said at the start, is about kind of empowering people to do things for themselves. So we really firmly believe that pretty much everyone, if you've got the time and the inclination, could technically be able to build most websites for most businesses because of the way that content management systems work. So that doesn't mean to say that you have to build it yourself. You might just say, well, I don't much fancy it, I would rather pay someone to do it. It's obviously perfectly fine. But if you're not sure, you're thinking, well, could I do it? Should I get someone if money's tight and you have to do it yourself? So things to think about. You need to be not afraid of getting your hands dirty. So sometimes it can be quite a frustrating process trying to get something to look exactly the way you want it. You need to be reasonably confident with technology, but you certainly don't need to be a developer, a coder, a technological whiz. So if you're confident with email, you know, you can write a Word document and sort of move things around on a PowerPoint presentation, you almost certainly have enough technical know-how to be able to use a modern content management system to develop a website for yourself. So if what you need is fairly straightforward, as I mentioned at the start, we've got a couple of options to help you. We've got a free video tutorial, which is build a one-page website in an hour, which is literally that. It goes through the process of building a pretty simple one-page site. We've spoken to quite a few people that have been through the process and followed the instructions, thinking at the start that they wouldn't know anything about building a website, and, you know, half a day later or whatever, having a website. So that's fine for a relatively straightforward site if you just want a kind of shop window for your business. If you want something a bit more in depth with numerous pages and different kind of functionality, building a site using WordPress, our self-paced training course goes into that in much more detail. And that includes a whole load of stuff about SEO, about setting up an e-commerce store. So that really is everything you need for a fully functioning site. If you're working with an existing site, then I think our view would really be basic content changes you should be able to do yourself. You're always going to be paying more than you need to, and things taking longer than they need to if you're reliant on whoever built the site to make changes for you. We'll talk more about this a little bit later on. But things like adding new pages to menus, editing existing pages, you know, updating your pricing, changing images, adding videos and so on, you should be able to do those. Those are the sorts of changes a reasonably competent technical person should be able to do. Simple design changes probably also, so things like maybe changing the fonts or changing the colors, that kind of thing. We don't obviously recommend that you sort of start rampaging around in the back end of your website if you've never done anything in there before. So train to learn how to use whatever the content management system is, and also obviously take a backup before you make any changes. So if you're using WordPress, we have a little free video guide. There's a plugin called Updraft Plus that you can use to back up your WordPress site. That's just a kind of basic precaution in case you make a mistake or something goes wrong, and you want to just be able to revert back to the previous version of your site without any stress. Types of things where you might be better off asking for help. And obviously this depends on you as an individual. So if you're pretty technical, a lot of this stuff you probably would be able to do yourself. But if you're really starting from scratch, if you need quite a complicated site, so if it's got lots of different pages and it needs lots of different kinds of functionality, you know, maybe it needs an e-commerce store, maybe it needs event bookings, maybe it needs a sort of registration section, hidden content. Wherever you're getting into the realms of functionality, you might find that it's better to ask a professional to do it for you. If you need something that's really specifically tailored to your particular business, so if you need a design done that's completely unique for your business, or you've got some special piece of functionality that you need building, most CMSs, WordPress for example, works on a plugin basis. So you want to extend the functionality of the site, you find a plugin that does what you want, you plug it in, you turn it on, you configure it, jobs are good. And if you want something that you can't do via a plugin, then at that point you're probably in the realms of needing professional help. If you're in something like financial services or healthcare, some kind of really highly regulated market where security is extremely important, it's worth getting professional help on that aspect of the site. If you're switching from an existing site, maybe from one CMS to another, so you want to move from Squarespace to WordPress or WordPress to Squarespace, or anything to anything else, or if, let's say, you've run a WordPress site, but you're using a very old version of WordPress, it's not been updated for quite a long time. Again, those are the areas where you can run into problems potentially. So that might be somewhere where it's useful to get help. If you've been using a WordPress theme for a very long time on a site and you want to update the theme, that can be tricky. If you need integration, so let's say, for example, you're running a web store, an e-commerce store. So the basics of setting up an e-commerce store is in the category of things people can generally do themselves. But if you then need that store to integrate with your accounting system or your stock management system or whatever it might be, then that's probably something that you would need professional help with. And a lot of this depends on how much time you're prepared to put in to learn how to do things. So if you're happy to devote the time to learn stuff, then all of this could be things you could do yourself. But if you need something quickly, then probably you're going to be better off asking for professional help. Hard-coded or CMS, as I talked about, hard-coded site is written directly in HTML or whatever language, doesn't use a CMS. So that means that only people who can code in HTML or the language the site is written in can then make changes to the site. So that is a big restriction. It makes it very difficult for a sort of lay person to make changes to the site. So really, for that reason, there's very few circumstances in which you would go for hard-coded. If you had, your website was really kind of incidental to your business, you just wanted a static page that sits there and, it's not going to need any changes, maybe hard-coded would be okay for that. Or if you have something that's so particular to your particular requirements that it actually can't be done. So CMSs offer almost unlimited customization possibilities, but not completely unlimited. You're still working within a theme or a template that somebody else has built. So if what you imagine in your head is so far out that it can't be achieved using a CMS, then you might have to hard code it. But really, modern CMSs, the benefits are so substantial, editable by anybody. You don't have to be a technical person. They're super easy to use. They've got security and SEO and so on built in. It's much easier to control who accesses the site. And as I mentioned, it's easier to extend the functionality. So we are in this situation with a client of ours at the moment who has a static HTML site and wants to add a piece of functionality to it that would be very straightforward if it was a WordPress site or a Squarespace site. Would probably be a couple of hours work, but because it's a hard-coded static site, it's substantially more complicated to extend it and build in this additional piece of functionality. So if you're going for a content management system, we recommend WordPress, as you've probably gathered by now. The reasons why: there are other CMSs available, all kinds of things, Wix, Squarespace, Weebly, and a load of others. And quite often, if you're really starting from scratch, some of these others can look a bit more attractive. So WordPress isn't necessarily the most intuitive straight out of the box, and some of these others are. But the disadvantages of the others really kind of negate that benefit. So WordPress is free. Many of the others, not all of them, but many of the others work on a subscription model, and certainly the main ones, things like Wix, Squarespace, Weebly, are all on a subscription model. WordPress is by far the most widely used content management system on the internet. So it's because of that much more widely supported than any of the other options. So that means it's easier to get plugins, it's easier to get themes. There are many more developers around who can work with WordPress, and that's all beneficial to you. It's an open source product, WordPress, whereas many of the others are commercial operations, and it's a much riskier proposition to go with a commercial operator because they can close down their business. So it's unlikely, but not impossible, that Squarespace or Wix or whatever might decide next week, next year, 5 years, 10 years from now, that's it, we're going to get out of the website game. And if that happens, pretty much stuffed. There's not really anything you can do. And actually, we were in this example happened with another more obscure content management system, which we then had to hurriedly build a site for a client who was on a content management system that was basically being switched off at the end of March this year. So that is a concern. There's also sort of legal position in terms of who owns your content. When you're putting your content in the hands of commercial operators, you're giving up control of that content. So WordPress we recommend because it's better, and because it gives you the control that, because your website is so central to your business, is important. If you want to learn more about WordPress, we have a webinar specifically on that, another free webinar, Why Choose WordPress. I've given you a link here so you can find out more about that if that's of interest. So you might build your site yourself, but you might decide that you want to work with designers or developers. So it's worth thinking a little bit about how that process works and what the considerations are when you're choosing who you want to work with. So designer and developer are two different jobs. You might hear these terms used kind of interchangeably, but they are actually two different jobs. although quite often on a small site, you might practically find it's the same person doing both. So the two different aspects of work that are involved in building a website, the design part is how does it look, the style of it, the look and the feel, the colors, the fonts, how the pages are laid out. The development part, the build bit, is putting together the pages, making sure the functionality works, are the forms plugged in the back end, does the e-commerce store talk to the stock management system, etc. So as I said, on a small site, that might be the same person. On a larger site, it might be two different people. If you're using an agency to build the site for you, almost certainly it'll be two different people. You don't necessarily need a designer to come up with a completely bespoke design for your site. So WordPress and most other CMSs work on themes. You install a theme and that gives you a kind of a look and feel as a starting point. And depending on which theme you choose, you can then customize that so that behind the scenes, it looks, it's the same theme, but on the front end, it looks bespoke. So most of the sites that we build for people, we use a theme called Astra. And if you looked at all the different sites that we've built, they would all look completely different on the front end because Astra is highly customizable. But behind the scenes, the functionality is very similar. So you get kind of benefits in terms of knowing how a theme works. If you are building something very complicated or you want something highly customized, then you might end up with both a designer and a developer. And as I said, if you hire an agency, almost certainly that's the case. If you're hiring an agency, all of that gets taken care of by the agency. So it's not for you to then go out and find a designer and then find a developer. They would all be housed within the agency. So questions that you might ask if you're thinking of hiring a designer, a developer, whether this is a freelancer or whether it's an agency that you're going to work with, key things that you need to think about when deciding who to work with. So first of all, ask them what content management system they use. So we use WordPress. If you come to us and say, we want you to build us a Squarespace site, we won't do it because that's not where our expertise lies. And other agencies will have the same, you know, we only use X, we only use Y. Sometimes you might come across an agency that has some kind of like in-house bespoke content management system or something very obscure that only they use. Been in this situation a couple of times when I've been the client rather than the agency. When I asked the question one time of an agency, why don't you use WordPress? Why are you using this obscure system? They basically said, because WordPress makes it too easy for our clients to change the sites themselves, which I appreciate. When you've built something beautiful, you don't want clients messing it up, but equally it's an incredibly cynical way of doing business to basically keep your clients as your hostages. So ask them what CMS they use. Ask them whether they build custom sites or they use templates. And related to that, do they have any experience building sites in your market? So there are agencies out there that specialize in building websites for particular kinds of businesses and basically rolling out sites using a pre-existing template. So they might have a template that they use to build websites for garages, for example. And they've got lots and lots of experience building garages websites, but they use the same template for all of them. So ask to have a look at some examples of other sites that people have built. Ask who's actually going to be doing the building. So is the person I'm talking to now going to be the person who's actually building the site, or is there somebody else behind the scenes that I haven't met? Agencies sometimes build in-house. They have staff. Sometimes they outsource. They use freelancers and sometimes offshore freelancers. So will you be able to work directly with the designer? Will you know who the designer is, or are you going to be going through a project manager? I'm not saying either one of these options is right or wrong. There's plenty of reasons why going through a project manager is better, and there might be other circumstances where working with a designer is better. But it's just asking the question, can you work within my budget? This is key. And I think this is really a conversation you need to have fairly early on, because you can avoid wasting a lot of time if you know that a particular agency only works. So quite often agencies will have a minimum project size, like we won't look at anything less than whatever, 10 grand or 100 grand or £500,000, whatever it might be. So if you're at the smaller end of the scale, nearer to the 10 grand than the £500,000, you might struggle to find an agency, or you'd be looking for an agency that really specialises in smaller projects. So can you work within my budget is quite often like the last conversation that you have, but actually should probably be one of the first conversations. Think about how many rounds of amends are allowed for. So when somebody comes back and quotes, what's included within that? So can you then go back with an infinite number of changes, or is there a set number of changes? How is the process going to work of kind of allowing for changes to be developed? So on the one hand, obviously, you don't want to be in a situation where they present you with something and you have to take it or leave it because you can't make any changes. But equally, it's not practical for the designer to allow an infinite number of changes. So how is that process going to work? Who's going to actually do the building of the website? Who's going to load the content? So typically, an agency would build the kind of structure of the site and then leave it up to you to populate it with content. So if you want them to build the actual content onto the site as well, you need to talk about that up front. Likewise, who provides the images? So are they going to source the images? Do you already have images that you want them to use? What's going to happen after the site goes live? So they're just going to hand it over to you and walk away and that's it? Or is there some kind of proper handover with some training that's included, or can you pay extra for that? What support do you get from them? So if you do find a problem with it or you want to make a change, how's that process managed? And then sometimes if you've got other things that you want doing, you think, well, these people, we get on well, perhaps they'll also help with my SEO or my graphic design or social media. It's always worth asking what other areas people work in. So if you're thinking about hiring an agency, you would need to write a brief for whatever it is that you want, what your website should include. And these are the kind of key things that you would include in that brief. So first of all, description of your business. Who's the site for? What do you do? What's the purpose of the site? What do you want the site to achieve for your business? So is it about practical lead generation? Is it about communicating information to existing customers? What's it for? What's the scope of the project? So are we redesigning something that already exists? Are we starting from scratch, building something completely new? What are the things we want to have delivered? So that might just be some page templates for the website, but it might also be other assets, logos, writing some content, setting up email addresses. So you need to pin down fairly early on what is and is not in scope for the project. Give the designer some kind of an idea about the sort of tone of voice that you're going for, the visual style that you're aiming for. By all means, point them at some sites that you like and some sites that you don't like. Not really so copy this, don't copy that, but just to give them a sense of what you like and what you don't like. If there are kind of non-negotiables. So we had a client years back who didn't want any green on their website because they thought green was unlucky. So if that's your case, if you've got an unlucky color that you don't want using on your website, flag that up early on. Anything else that needs including or not including? The goals of the project we've talked about. Who's it aimed at? Who are the people that are going to be using the site? Key competitors. Again, not to copy them, but just to get a sense of, so your website needs to feel like it's at home in a kind of surrounded by your competitors, not look like an outlier unless you want it to. Something about the design requirements and the technical specifications. So if you've got an existing brand, what are the colors, what are the fonts, the sizes, the logos? Timescales, how quickly do you need it? What's realistic? Budget, as we've talked about. And the deliverables is, again, just a list of things that you expect as the outputs of the project. And then a question that we get asked a lot, unsurprisingly, is how much is it going to cost? And this is one of those sort of how long is a piece of string kind of questions. It's very difficult to say. You can go out and look on a freelancing kind of hub and get somebody who would build you a site for £100, or you could spend 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, really whatever you like. But it is useful to understand something about the factors that influence that cost. So the first one is going to be the size of the site in terms of actually not just the number of pages, but the different types of pages. So a designer or developer is typically going to build you templates for the different types of pages. So if you think about your site and the content that you have on it, you will need a home page, and you'll probably need a contact us page. And some of these, you'll just have one of that type of page, but others, you might have a lot of that type of page. So you would need a style for a blog page, and you might have tens or hundreds of pages that follow that template. If you've got an e-commerce store, you need a template for a product page, and you might have tens or hundreds or thousands of pages that actually use that template. So the designer needs to know how many templates do we need? And the more templates they have to design, the more it's going to cost you. The functionality is obviously going to influence the cost. So the more complicated the site is in terms of what it needs to do, the more it's going to cost, because it's going to take longer for somebody to build it, because you need higher level of expertise for somebody to build it, and just sometimes just the practical costs of buying the bits that you need to plug everything together. How much you need something that's completely unique and how much you're happy to use an existing template, the more unique, it's unique or it's not unique, but the more tailored it's going to be to your organization, the more it's going to cost. The happier you are to use something that's a fairly generic template, the cheaper it's going to be. Larger agencies, as I mentioned, will often have a minimum project size, whereas independent freelancers, particularly those that are working abroad, are likely to be much cheaper. And there are websites like Fiverr that you might have come across, which is a marketplace really for freelancers to bid for projects. And you can get stuff very cheaply on there. But I would guard against, don't treat your website like a commodity. So price is a factor that you should consider. And obviously you can't afford to spend £10,000 on a website if you've only got £5,000, but don't make price be the key driving consideration, because you get what you pay for. And you're asking people to do technical work using very specific skills that they've trained hard to get, that not everybody has. And any decent designer or developer is going to add a huge amount of value in terms of understanding how to build the best site for your business that shouldn't be underestimated. And for most businesses, your website is such an essential part of the business, it's a big mistake to do it on the cheap. So we're going to talk briefly about hosting and then about maintenance, and that will basically take us through the whole process. So hosting, as we talked about earlier, your website is made up of a series of files that live in folders, and that structure of folders needs to sit somewhere on the internet that's publicly accessible. So you could run it off your home computer, as I said earlier, but you would have to have it turned on the whole time and make sure that it was permanently accessible, and obviously that is not a feasible thing. So what a website hosting company does is take all of that for you, serve the files up, maintain the files for one or more websites. You lease space on a hosting company's web server, and they use that space to store your website's files so that visitors can view them. So offering hopefully speedy access to your site, secure access to your site, reliable access to your site. All of the files that make up your website, including the WordPress files themselves, they all live on the hosting company's servers. So as a general rule, it's a good idea to have hosting in place before, if you're building your site yourself, before you start building it. You can build a site locally on your laptop and then export it to your hosting company, but this is more complicated. So better get the hosting set up, put a WordPress installation on your domain and put it behind a coming soon plugin or something like that, build it and then put it live. Most of the companies that will sell you a domain, like 123reg or GoDaddy, will also host your site. You don't have to have your domain and your hosting done by the same company, but it can make life easier if you're starting from scratch to have them done both by the same company. And the cost, you can get hosting incredibly cheaply even free these days, typically starting around maybe £5 a month. It's going to depend on things like the size of your site, how complicated your site is, and whether you're happy to share space with other sites. And this, as with the building, it's not really a good area to cut costs. So let's talk about the cost a little bit more. Shared hosting, so your site and a load of other sites all live on the same machine, the same server, is cheaper, but it's also going to be slower and it's less robust because your site is competing with all these others for space. At the cheaper end of the scale, you're not really going to get very much support from your hosting company. And support is one of those things that you don't really feel like you need at all, and then you do need it, and when you need it, you really, really need it. So most of the time, nothing happens, everything runs smoothly. You don't need to think about your hosting from one day to the next. But if your site goes down for whatever reason, you urgently want support. And at the cheaper end of the market, that's really just going to be bare bones, only email, maybe no phone. If your site is mission critical to your business, so if you've got an e-commerce site that is your whole business, it needs to be live 100% of the time, you are going to have to pay more for your hosting to have that kind of level of service agreement. Backups, we touched on backups earlier. A cheap hosting plan almost certainly won't include any backups of your site. That's not necessarily a deal breaker because you can back it up yourself via WordPress. Pointed you to a video earlier showing you how to do that. And as with the design, you kind of get what you pay for. So a lot of people think of hosting as a commodity and go for the cheapest option, but there are plenty of reasons why you might be better off paying a little bit more. We actually have a blog post about this that digs into this in more detail, so you can click on that link and go through. And we have a client that's run into exactly this problem at the moment, who actually has a fairly complicated site that's pretty important to their business, with a lot of content on it and a lot of functionality. They're paying the absolute minimum for the hosting, and consequently the site runs slowly and it's a bit clunky, and they really need more robust hosting. The cheapness is the problem. Once you've built your site and you've put it live, or somebody else has built it for you and put it live, there's a question about what happens in terms of ongoing maintenance and support once the site is live. So think about what support you're going to need. So will you need training to be able to run the site yourself? And if you will, who's going to provide that? Is that included in the cost of the development? Is it something that the developer even offers? Everything but really the most basic static site, you're going to need some kind of ongoing support and maintenance if you want to change the content. And this literally can be as simple as just our prices update once a year, but you still need to be able to make those changes. Things like keeping the site secure, hackers and so on are continually just poking away at content management systems and plugins and so on to try and find vulnerabilities. And so it's really important. So WordPress, for example, releases new versions all the time, partly because it uncovers some vulnerability in the code. It solves that, launches a new version. If you don't upload those new versions, you don't install those new versions, you can run into problems with security. So who's going to do that? Are you going to do that? Is your hosting company going to do that? Is your developer going to do that? If SEO is important to you, Google's SEO requirements change all the time. So you need to be able to make the kind of changes that Google asks for. Again, site speed is important, and as technology changes, you need to make changes to the site to keep up with that. New legislation comes in. So in 2018, we did a whole load of work for numerous clients who just urgently needed to make functionality changes to their sites in order to become compliant with GDPR. So some of these things you can do yourself, and others you might want to get help with. All of them you might want to get help with, that's perfectly fine. As I said earlier, small things like changes to content and functionality, you are probably better off being able to do yourself, because it's going to be more expensive and slower to get somebody else to do them for you. But some of these more technical things you will need support with. So who's going to provide that? Will it come from your designer? How much will they charge? How quickly will they turn around requests? So we talk to people all the time who say, I feel like I'm completely beholden to my designer. You know, whenever I want the simplest change, it costs me £100 and it takes 3 weeks to do it. And if you're on the kind of client end of that, that feels endlessly frustrating. But if you're on the agency end of that, it's like such a difficult process to manage effectively. So kind of ultimately, you just need to be prepared to pay for people to do things. If you're not prepared to do it yourself, you have to pay for somebody else to do it, and you have to pay the going rate for that. So it's really worth knowing how to make these kinds of basic changes, as I said. So in terms of next steps, following on from that, if WordPress is your thing, you can do a lot of the things that we've talked about today yourself. And we've got these training courses that we are offering for WordPress. We've got a whole series of free resources that touch on some of the aspects of what I've talked about today in a bit more detail. We've got other webinars, some of which are free, some of which are paid for. Anything that's paid for, you can get 20% off as you've been here today. Quote the code webinar20 at the checkout, and that discount will automatically be applied. And that is it for today's webinar. So thank you very much for listening. I will hand it back to Rachel and ask if there have been any questions.
I've got a couple that have come through. Thank you very much. So someone else has the domain that I am looking for. How do I get it?
Well, you pay the big bucks or you look for a different domain, I would say. I think there are processes in place to stop what domain squatting used to be a thing, where people would kind of buy up a load of domains like marksandspencers.com and bbc.com, and there's been some famous examples of that. And I think a lot of domain companies have put in place processes to deal with that. So if you feel like somebody has bought the domain that is your brand name, for example, then there might be kind of legal processes for getting that back. But if I want Lorna's practice site and some other bugger has already bought that, there's not going to be anything I can do about that. I can make them an offer and they can say yes or no. But really, in that situation, you're looking for another domain, I think.
Okay. Images. Where does one source free or lower cost images?
So there are a number of sites that offer royalty-free images. So we use one called Unsplash, which is very good. So Unsplash, there's one called Pexels, P-E-X-E-L-S, and one called Pixabay, P-I-X-A-E-A-Y, Pixabay, like it sounds. And all of these offer royalty-free images that you can just use without, I mean, they like it if you credit the person that provided the image, but it's certainly not required. You can get relatively cheap paid programs with stock photography companies, so Shutterstock and places like that. Lying behind the question, I guess, is a sort of understanding that you can't just go to Google Images, pick an image and stick it on your website, and this will always lead to problems. And we've got several clients that have ended up in quite sticky legal situations because of doing that. But the Unsplash in particular, I think, is very good. The quality of the images on that is very good. It's much better than what you might expect for free imagery.
Okay, thank you. What is SEO, please?
SEO is search engine optimization. So it's the process of helping Google primarily, but other search engines as well, helping Google to understand what your site is about, what the pages on your site are about, and that it's a good quality site and that it kind of meets all of the requirements to encourage Google to show your pages in its search listings. So for most businesses, you'll get traffic to your website via different sources. So for example, we send out emails. Most of you guys are here because you've had an email from us. So some of the traffic to our site comes from emails, some comes from our social media posts, some comes from people that already know about us and just type our name directly into the browser. But a big chunk comes from searching. People search for, how do I do X, Y, or Z in WordPress? And we've built content on our site that's designed to answer those questions that we hope will bring traffic to our site. So SEO is the process of optimizing your site for Google. And we have a basics of SEO webinar that we run fairly frequently, and we also have a downloadable free PDF guide to SEO, which if somebody's starting from scratch, the downloadable guide is really sort of back to basics, and the SEO webinar likewise. That might be something to sign up for if you want to learn more about that.
Okay, thank you. Can you say more about open source? Maybe Steve can say more about open source.
I could, but I feel like it would be better if Steve said something about open source.
Yeah.
Steve explains this very well.
Yeah, sure. Open source. So it's the principle really that a program, a bit of code is available for people to use and tweak and do with it what they want. And so a bit like, say, a recipe for flapjacks or something, you might have a basic recipe and that's available out there and you can pull it down. You can choose to tweak it or make it so that it's something that you want, something that you like. You could make a book and collect all your different recipes and make some money from it. Or you could run a restaurant and use that recipe and sort of make some money by doing that. But the recipe and the way that you use it is basically there and it's open source and it's available. And in the same way, things like WordPress and other bits of code are available on the internet and available for you to download and either use as it is, or you can take it and tweak it and make it better or make it fit what it is that you want. And so open source really is a way of just sort of sharing knowledge really, and sharing ways of doing things with computers and with the internet. And it's really what kind of underpins a lot of the technology under things like Google and Facebook and Amazon. Right at the core of it is a lot of open source stuff that they've adapted for being able to run their services. And that's why we say using something like WordPress is useful, because you can sort of stand on their shoulders really using open source. Does that explain it? I know the flapjacks might be. Flapjacks, yeah.
Yes, I think so. I think so. I think I need a designer because I'm not technical, but I only have a few £100 to spend. What's the best thing to do?
Well, two things. The best thing to do is buy our introduction to WordPress course, and actually not technical shouldn't be a barrier. So we are confident that most people can build a good website themselves, and WordPress comes with themes, and the theme is what gives you the design. So you don't have to kind of think about laying out the page and how might it look and what's the best practice. All of that stuff is done for you in a good theme. If you do want somebody else to do it for you and your budget is very limited, then Fiverr probably is your best bet. We have some clients who've used like students. So if you know anyone in a university and you want to, you know, offer up a project for students who are doing digital marketing, that can be a way of getting cheaper resource. The Kickstarter program, Rach, do you know something about that?
Yeah, I've got a couple of clients who've hired in some marketing resource using the Kickstarter scheme, the government's Kickstarter scheme. I don't really know the full details on, you know, what the costs are and so on of that, because you have to employ them. So if you're looking for an employee anyway, and you can hire somebody in with some marketing skills, that might be a route.
Yeah, Fiverr is probably, so that is Fiverr, is a marketplace of freelance work, and you'll find people on there offering to build your website for, you know, very little cost, but kind of go into that with your eyes open, with all the provisos that I talked about in terms of you get what you pay for. If it's super cheap, it's going to be super cheap for a reason.
Okay. I don't think I've got any more questions that have come through. No, we haven't. Okay, so I'm going to say then thank you to everybody who attended. As I mentioned, we've recorded the session and we'll get an email out to you later today with a link to the recording and the slides and so on. Thank you, Steve, for helping with questions in the background, and thank you, Lorna, for your presentation. Hopefully we'll see all of you again soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.